Okay, hi everyone. Chris, just confirm me you can hear me okay and you can see my screen share there.
Oh. Yep, we can see.
Okay, great. All right, so welcome everyone, and thanks for being here. So I wanted to do sort of a general or talk about acoustics. I didn't intend for this to end up being my title, but I thought I'd leave it just to intrigue people of what might be going on with acoustics. As Chris mentioned, I've been studying bats for over a decade and a half in lots of different ways, but of course acoustics is the major part of how you study bats here in Ontario. So I thought I'd talk generally about acoustics. I've studied all over the place with detectors, more than a dozen different kinds of equipment and hundreds of locations. I've processed millions of files. So trying to kind of bring it together, and I thought I'd gear a presentation. It's kind of geared more to people getting into acoustics, but hopefully a lot of the things that I say will kind of instigate some of the people with more experience to chime in a little later in the question period in the discussion to say maybe if you do things differently or you see them differently, and we can have a good debate about it. So the way I do it, I thought I'd kind of break this down a little bit. Of course, the first step is you really need to get into the literature. Don't just dive straight into bat acoustics without knowing a bit about what it is you're studying. That's a really, really important first step. And when you choose your equipment, take the time to understand what it is you're doing and how you want to use the equipment and what you want to do. You need to test that equipment. Don't expect to open the box and set it up in the field. You need to know what you're using. I'm going to talk a little bit about field setup as much as I can, and how to collect the data, and then how we organize the data a little bit, or just that you need to be very organized, and there's different ways to do it. I'll talk a bit. That's kind of where there's a line there under step 5 and step 6 where a lot of people can go that far and collect the data, and then the analysis can be kind of a whole different step, which you might do, or you might have someone else to do. There's several clients that I work with who collect all the data and I do the analysis for them, or you can go the whole way and do the analysis too. And then you can, once you do the analysis, it's very important to understand how to interpret those results. And then you can share them on things like ChiroVox, or also our local NA-BAT and BAT-AMP, which I'll talk a little bit about. So we wish the bats would read all the literature that we've written about them, and they'd follow the rules that we think they should follow. They don't always do that. They surprise us almost 100% of the time, but there is a lot of information out there, and you really should do your research. There was a bat symposium on echolocation a few years ago, and there's several studies in the Canadian Journal of Zoology that are worth reading to understand what it is you're getting into if you're going to do analysis of bat work. And Erin Fraser and some of her friends put together a very nice little research document, the second edition of the bat echolocation research, which really kind of guides how you can do echolocation studies. You need to understand what is echolocation. It's not like birds or frogs that are singing for their mates and to advertise their territory. So you need to understand what that really is and what it is you're studying. The term bats are not birds is used a lot in many papers, and it's very important to understand. We can't take birding principles and apply them to how we study bats. And a lot of people tend to try and do that, but that's important not to do. It's really important to understand the limitations of what we can get out of acoustic studies as much as it is what we can benefit from acoustic studies, because some people try to take it a little further and try to interpret too much from their data. So you need to know where that line is. There are different guidelines out there all over the place. And in Ontario, it's sort of unofficial. There's different guidelines here and there that people are using and following, and some of them have changed. There's other guidelines in different jurisdictions that may be more detailed or have different ways of doing things. So if you're needing to follow guidelines, you should have a look at what those are and understand what it is that's trying to be done and the questions being asked. And you need to recognize that when it comes to bats, there's still a lot that we just don't know. And so we're trying to figure this out as we go along. And acoustics is a great tool to do that with. So Toby likes to show a graph like this, and I'm not going to steal his thunder on it. If you want to know more about the Mount Stupid and the learning curve, you should talk to Toby. But the point that is always made is that it is a steep learning curve. If you're just getting into acoustics for bats, expect that there's a lot to learn. And then just when you think you know it all, you realize that maybe you didn't know as much as you thought you knew, and you should keep learning. So, and if you really only do bat acoustics, for one little, in June or the summer, and then you forget about them for a year and go back to it, you're gonna have to relearn all that stuff. So, just be aware that there's a lot to understand. So one of the things that you'll probably try to learn first is sort of the seasons when you want to study bats here in Ontario. So obviously, you know, as Dr. Joe spoke about, they have a whole different system, and depending where you are, this all changes. But here in Ontario, and of course, we have a broad latitude as well. So Southern Ontario would be different than Northern Ontario a little bit. But you know, spring emergence is usually in April or May. There's some good papers on the phenology of emergence from the Willis Lab and some other places. But if you're not at a hibernation site, you're usually focused on the maternity roosting season, which some guidelines say is the month of June. I can definitely show from my data that really you can start kind of in late May and go until about mid-July is when you see the maternity roosting activity. And that's both the pre-volant period when there are no juveniles or young of that year, subadults that are calling in the population, and then the post-volant when the babies are out and they're also echolocating and you get more activity. And then when you get to August and September, that's swarming and pre-migration or pre-hibernation and migration. You get a lot of activity there, usually at swarming sites, but really you get a lot of activity almost everywhere. Bats are really moving around a lot. And then after September, you'll get a little bit of residual activity while they're kind of hanging out near the hibernation sites. If you really want to know what's going on and you want to do long-term monitoring, which I really like to do, you want to be recording almost the entire season from May 1st to September 30th. So that gives you the whole idea of what's going on at a location. If you're at a hibernation site, you might want to go even earlier into April and maybe even later into October. But that really tells you a lot about what's going on at a location. So when you choose your detector, there is a lot to choose from now. There's all kinds of decisions, and the technology has really evolved a lot, especially in the early 2000s and 2010s up until now. A lot of them are getting pretty similar now, but they've changed over the last 15, 20 years a lot. There's a lot of things to think about. First of all, you want to decide whether you're doing passive or active monitoring, and I'll clarify what that is. Active monitoring is when you're holding something in your hand and you're aiming and you're walking around, or it might be when you're doing driving transects on the roof of the car, that sort of thing. You need to, that's when you're aiming the detector, essentially. It's in your hand, you're controlling it. Passive recording is when you leave it unattended, and usually it's full night recording for long periods of time. So that's important to know. We have the discussion of full spectrum versus zero cross. I won't get into it much because most people are not doing zero cross in Ontario. That's kind of an older thing, but it is used in lots of other jurisdictions. One thing I'll point out is that you never want to mix detector models. This is from personal experience. If you have, one brand and another brand on the same project, you don't know if they're doing the same thing, if they're recording the same thing. So it's to be consistent, at least within your own project, you want to try and use the same kind of detector all around. Because each detector is a little bit different in how they record and what they will get. When you put them head to head, you're going to get different results and you can interpret them differently. So you want to be as consistent as you can. And each of them have pros and cons. They might last longer on the battery. They might have better microphones. They might have better data management or filters. So you want to kind of research all that before you get into it. And the things that we usually are thinking about are power capacity for one, how long can it last? Most detectors now, full spectrum detectors, easily last weeks, some of them months. So that's not a big issue as it was before. The data capacity also used to be a big issue, but now it's not. We can get huge SD cards to load our data on, so you can last a long time. Most detectors will last a long time now. Not as big of an issue. But data quality, in my opinion, is probably one of the most important things to think about. You want to have a good microphone with a good signal to noise ratio so that you can hear the bats and you're not really listening to them, but it detects them, and you have a good clean recording as much as possible, because that's going to be really important in the analysis stage. So when you first get your detector and you open the box, like I said, don't expect to just go in the field. You need to spend some time understanding the different settings, the trigger levels, the filters, all those things. You need to know when to program your detector to turn on and turn off. And the standard now, basically internationally for passive monitoring, is 30 minutes before sunset to 30 minutes after sunrise. And that's a standard in a lot of detectors that's automatically programmed in them now. So for the most part, we do that. There are some guidelines, even some in Ontario, that have said 5-hour recording window. I don't know where that came from, but just ignore that, because we measure bats based on passes per night. So you really need to record the whole night. And when you get to know that there's a few settings you can change, like trigger levels and different sensitivity, you want to get to know that within your detector and really try it out and see what works best in your situation. The factory defaults aren't always the best settings, so you want to check them and see what you use. need to set up and test those detectors, and testing them in the field is great, but also just testing the microphone response. So I do a calibration of all the detectors that I have in most of my clients' ones each year to say, how is that particular, it's not the detector, it's really just the microphone. How is it performing? And is it performing the same as every other microphone of that particular brand? And I did this for over 300 detectors a few years back of lots of different models and brands, and found that there is quite a bit of difference. Some detectors are consistent in what they do and some are not. And there's quite a range in what each model will do. So you really should test your microphone, especially before you go in the field, to make sure it's functioning properly. And I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the Wildlife Acoustics has a calibrator that only tests it at 40 kilohertz, and it only works with Wildlife Acoustics equipment. So if you're not doing those things, it's not going to do you any good. There's other sound generators you can use. I use the AT100 that can tell you, across the spectrum what sort of sound is being heard by the detectors. So you need to think about these things to make sure your equipment's working properly before you go in the field. I do this detailed calibration once a year, and then when I'm in the field, you may want to listen just to make sure that you're getting the right sound. So you need to plan your approach ahead of time. How many detectors do you need? How much do you want to spread them out? What habitat do you want to put them on? These are all things you want to pre-plan, and you don't need to get super detailed in the location. You want to have an approximate location, and then when you're in the field, you're going to refine that, change that, get the right orientation. You want to decide if you're going to have a detector that lasts, the entire active season, maybe multiple years, or you're going to move them around. Usually you want to get at least a couple of weeks of data at any particular location, because there's enormous variation almost everywhere. So a night or two is really not going to tell you much. You want to get at least some good period of time at any location. And what habitats are you going to target? Is that species specific? Are you looking for hibernation or swarming or roosting, migration? What is it that you're studying? So you want to kind of pre-plan that and know the differences between each of the species if you're targeting a particular species. If you're looking for little browns, you want to go to that kind of habitat. If you're looking for hoary bats, you might want to be in a different place higher up, something like that, right? So you need to think about this different species ecology. And so that kind of feeds, I was going to say that in this slide, but talking about the specific location that you put them, first of all, your mic orientation and height are important. So you want to get the microphone off the ground. Usually there's all kinds of noise from vegetation on the ground. You want to get them at least 2 or 3 meters above the ground. We used to put them way up in Met towers, 30 meters high, to record migratory tree bats like hoary bats. We don't do that as much anymore, at least not here. So being a little closer to the ground is fine where you can reach it, but you still want to get it above the vegetation. And you almost never want to aim a microphone straight up, even though there are some manufacturers who have said straight up, and then verbally they say, oh no, we didn't mean to say that. The reason you don't want to aim it straight up is, first of all, the water will pool in the microphone element and it'll cause damage to your element. You don't want that because your microphone just won't work. But also, we want to always think about recording a bat as if it was flying straight at your microphone. If you think about, the broadcaster at the hockey game where there's a crowd of people around and he wants to hear from that pro that just came off the ice, you're going to aim your microphone right at his mouth, right? And you want to do that for bats too. You want to think about, where is the bat flying and where are we going to get the best recording from the mouth of the bat? And when you're aiming it straight up and the bat's flying perpendicular, you're not likely to get a good recording, or you'll get a very short recording as it passes by. It might be good quality, but short. You want to have it aiming more horizontal or in an upward angle to try and get that. Of course, bats are all over the place, so it's challenging, but we do the best we can. And in the example in the picture in the middle here, we're aiming it along an edge, usually, because bats are following that edge as opposed to coming in and out. So that's kind of what we're going for. So you got to think about the habitat and all the things going on here, where you want to put them. And it's important to have a data sheet to collect all this information, because this is important information later. You want to avoid noise. And then at the end, you're going to collect all this data. It's really important to organize it in a folder structure. I'm not going to go into what that is. Always have a duplicate in case you have file corruption. Keep it organized so that it can be analyzed later. Sometimes you don't go to that data till years later, so you really want to know what you have. And about data without metadata is basically useless data. This is important. If you don't know where you collected it, when you collected it, what the context was, the equipment, those are really important things that you have to know, and you need to record them really well and attach that data to your files. So choosing the analysis software, I won't get into the different software. Everybody has a preference. Each differ, just like the detectors. There's different things they can do. You want to think about the accuracy of species ID and quality and vetting. No software will do it all for you. There is definitely a learning curve. It's going to take a while to understand. You need to think about the settings, just like the detector itself, variables in the settings of your analysis. One little note about automated classifiers, they are often wrong. Don't assume they're right all the time. They get you kind of in the right ballpark. Some things are right, but there's a percentage that will be wrong. And so you need to do manual vetting, and you need to have the experience to be able to do that and understand the differences in a single file. Like this particular one called it 4 different species, and it was a nice clean call. So you need to be aware when there could be errors in the auto classification and vet them.
1 minute warning, Derek.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'll whip through the rest of it here. So I thought I'd put out this, I like this little cliche, when you hear hoof breeds, think horses, not zebras. So don't think that you've got that rare species automatically when there's all kinds of overlapping species. You need to think of what's most likely, and then and go through a process of understanding what it is you've actually got there, because the most likely answer is usually the right one. And there's social calls, so I won't get into social calls, but they can mess up all kinds of things. Bats do lots of different stuff, and we're trying to use the most standard echolocation calls for species identification, so beware of the social calls. They're a whole different world. In the interpretation, I'm whipping through here, I'm not going to get into everything. The interpretation of the data is important. So how many bat passes is enough to say that it's present? You know, you could say, well, is 1 bat pass per night on average enough over lots of nights? Do you need to record them on multiple nights? You really should. Remember, when you record a bat with acoustics, it only flew past your detector. Doesn't mean it touched that tree. Doesn't mean it used that cave. So you need to be mindful that that doesn't mean that it's actually using the habitat. It means it flew past. So when we look at the seasonal activity over a year, we can see major variation. And this is particularly one species over lots of years. We can see the activity picks up in May, and especially in late June and July, and then drops off in September. This kind of shows you that active period. We can look at averages per night, like mean bat passes per night by month. That's what this is, a standard deviation. This is hoary bats at a particular location. We can look at monthly means. It's important to use those to understand when are they most active and what are they doing. We can look at within night activity, the very first one. So these are high frequency bats and low frequency bats by month. And this is the activity within the night. You can see major activity at dusk and at dawn on that first one for high frequency bats in July. That's kind of indicating that you're probably near a roost or roosting area. And you can look for those patterns. Whereas later in the year, it's not as dominant in dusk and dawn. They're probably coming later, which they might be doing some swarming activity there. So trying to understand within night activity as well as across nights. And then you've got to have a place to put your data. Of course, you report it, you know, maybe in your particular project, but you can also go to something like the North American Bat Monitoring Program, NABAT, and this shows all kinds of data that's been posted. There's a lot in the US, not as much in Canada, a common story that we usually hear, but we're trying to help out. It's a North American project initiative, and we can be part of it. Zooming into Ontario, there is a fair bit of data that's come in Ontario. These are the squares where we've got some data, but there's lots of huge gaps. So you can put your data on this. And there's a couple different ways to do it. The NABAT program itself, they like when you use their data format. It can take a little bit of pre-planning if you want to actually do it as an NABAT grid square, which we'll hear about in the next presentation. It's nightly data, consecutive night data. You can't do like every other night or anything like that, or they won't accept that. You're posting the actual wave files. You're actually uploading all of that, the raw data or the analyzed data. You need a pre-plan, and there is some very strict formatting things, but there's greater tools in the analysis that they can do later and compare all the different stations, or you can even go in and use the NABAT data. You can obscure locations so if you want to. And then there's the BAT AMP, Bat Acoustic Monitoring portal. And that's a much simpler way. So that's good for if you've already collected data for some other purpose and you want to get it in there. You're only posting nightly summary spreadsheets. That's it. You're not posting the full metadata. You're not posting all the formatted wave files. It's easier and quicker, but of course there's less power in the analysis later. So you can upload your data in this way to share it with the rest of the world. So do you trust your acoustic surveys? Yes, you should trust your acoustic surveys as long as you take the time to collect very good data, to do the analysis properly, and to interpret them right, and think about all the limitations that there are and what they're really telling you and what they're not telling you. Acoustics in most jurisdictions, except Ontario, are the indicator to go further if you need to, whether it's more acoustics or doing netting and tracking. In Ontario, we often stop there, but you can trust your acoustics to an extent. see what they're telling you about and how to take it to the next step. And I kind of rushed through the end of it, but I'll just stop there and thank everyone for their time and open it up to questions.